Last time we were doing some login reg, and what we were doing is we were creating the new users and we were logging them in, but we did not have any validations. So that's basically what the thrust of this afternoon session is going to be about, is how can we validate what's coming in to our backend. All right, so let's get this project started again. Python server.py. Good. Still running. So what we want to validate are these inputs that are coming in through our reg form. And let's open up our file here. I'll close this out so you guys can see better. All right. So where we're registering was our Ninja's post route right in here. And the pieces that we want to basically check is, let's make sure that there is actually a first name that came through. So if they enter in a blank string or something like that, let's not accept that in our database. Make sense? Same thing on the last name. We want to make sure that it's there. The email is going to be a little bit trickier because we actually have to check and make sure that it meets certain criteria. So we're going to use something called regex for that. Anyone familiar with regex? Regular expressions. Yes, exactly. So let's just do the basics here. We'll first validate first name and last name. So here we have a reference to our form, and let's just do some kind of if logic here. So the first thing that we want to do is just set a variable to basically say, are there errors or not? Okay. So let's just say errors equals false. We're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that everything's okay, no problems. And then later on, if we find out that there were errors, then we'll treat that in a special way. So let's check these guys. So if len of form at first name is less than 1, what that means is that I actually have a blank string, and I don't want that to go through, right? So let's do something here. What do we want to do so that we can show that on the subsequent request? Flash. Let's flash that error. So we'll say flash, please enter a first name, exclamation point, so they know we mean business. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to change this little errors flag to true. So now we know that there was actually a problem. All right, errors equals true. Same thing here. So let's just copy this down for the last name as well. Go like that. Last name. Okay, last name. Okay, so then down here, before we even get to entering things into our database, let's check that flag and see if it's changed from false to true. So if it's changed to true, let's just redirect them, because on the redirect, obviously we're going to show them those error messages like we were before. So if errors, let's return a redirect to the /ninja's new route. Okay, and then let's just test this out. So let's go to localhost 5000 ninjas new. Okay, and then let's just try to enter this form. Password must be non-empty. What's that from? Oh, were we trying to hash a password before we checked any of this stuff? All right, let me move this out of the way. So we won't hash the password until we've actually ensured that validation, or that the inputs were correct. All right, so let's try that again. I'll try to enter this. Cool. Any questions about this part? No? Excellent. Okay, so the next thing that we needed to do, as we talked about, we need to do some type of regex validation for our email address. So in order to do that, we actually need to import something from RE. RE is, yes?
Before you continue,
Yeah.
a lot of times you'll see in web forms the errors
Mhm.
What happens if you do that? Is there additional consideration of the HTML, or if you put the, instead of just having like a global error box, you put it in line?
Yeah, so there are a couple things at play. I think a couple parts to your question. The first is that if we're validating on the front end, we may have never even made a request to our backend. So if we're using something like JavaScript validation, or if
Which is probably what you usually do with the
yeah, exactly. So here, type of email. I'm not even sure why that. Oh, let's try to show this real quick. So if we were to enter in an invalid email address, notice how that's kind of like a front-end validation thing. So HTML5 would prevent us from inserting an invalid email address. It's actually allowing, let's change this real quick. I'll say that this is required so that we can't get it through if it's blank. So let me just refresh this page real quick. And now if I try to do this, notice how it's saying please fill out this field because we made it required. So you don't necessarily have to use JavaScript for front-end validation, but if you use some other type of front-end validation, just be aware that a user can go, or a person can go in here and totally change this HTML. Like they can say, instead of type email, let's just make this type text. I don't want to be validated against the emails, or I don't want this to be required. A user, someone who's on your website can do that. This is why back-end validations are so important, because they can make these changes and try to get something through our, through our gate, so to speak. Yes?
Would they be able to touch your JavaScript file though?
Like once it's loaded, you mean? Or what?
Once it's, say I have a JavaScript that has some validation, and then it's linked to my HTML.
Possibly if, yeah, if they were using like some sort of cross-site scripting. So if you didn't properly escape things in your HTML, there would be a possibility that they could try to inject some JavaScript there. So that's a possibility. Yeah. And so again, and that's another reason why we want to make sure that the validation ultimately happens on the back end. That is sort of our final place to stop things before they get to our database. So make sure that you have that. Ideally, it's best if you've got front-end validation and back-end validation. For the sake of this exercise, we're pretty much focusing on the front end, or on the back end, sorry. Okay? So right now, we can't even get this form to submit because, oh, all of a sudden we can, because notice how I changed those inputs, right? But if I refresh it and actually do what the server was saying, now it's going to say, hey, that field is required. All right. So let me just change that so we can still keep focusing on our backend validations. Okay, so inside server.py, what I need to import is something from regex. So we'll say from re import compile. And what compile is going to do, it actually says right there, it's going to compile a regex expression pattern and return a pattern object. Okay, so what we'll be able to do is take that pattern object and match it against the email that they provide us, and we can then say, is this email valid or not? Okay. All right, so let's let's grab a regex pattern that we can actually use for this, because you guys aren't really going to be expected to know regex patterns very well. We'll use them a little bit in Django, but you're not going to need to be any kind of an expert in this at all. So this is what we can use for our email regex.
It's very straightforward.
Pretty straightforward, yeah. I'm sure you guys can write these in your sleep, right? So let's just grab this, and then we will compile it, and then we'll set that equal to a variable like they did here. So we'll say email regex equals this compiled version. So here, actually we can do it up above our routes if we want. So let's just go email regex equals, and then we'll compile this particular pattern right there. Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll match what comes in through the form, make sure that's right. If it's not, then we'll just flag an error in the same way that we were doing with the first name and the last name. So let's come down here. Okay. So if, and then the syntax of this is basically we're just going to say email regex, and then we're going to call this match method against the email input. All right. So we'll say if email regex, or actually we need to say if not, right? Because if it matches, that actually means it should be a valid. Well, keep in mind this doesn't mean that the email is valid. It just means that the pattern looks like it's a valid email. Okay. So we don't know for sure. We could try emailing that person. It might have been totally bogus. All right, so if not, this thing matches, and then we'll give it the form email. Then we want to flash an error. Please enter a valid email address. Okay, error is equals true. All right, good enough. So let's give this a shot on the front end. Let's say Bob Smith Bob. Oh no. Let me change that so that we're not actually validating in there. Okay, so this should be type text instead. Bob's here, right?
Yep.
You are.
I watched the last video.
Yeah, you got a shout out. All right. Let's try this again. So Bob, password. Oh, please enter a valid email address. So that did not match. Let's make it match. Bob Smith. Oh, actually, before we do that, let me add one little thing that we didn't do earlier today, which is just that if we've created a new user, let's add that new user's ID to session under the user ID. Remember? So what's going to happen is that when I insert this new Ninja, I'm actually going to get a new Ninja ID. So let's rename that so it makes sense. Inserting something will give us back the ID of the thing that we inserted. Instead of printing it, let's just add it to the session. So we'll say session at user ID equals that new Ninja ID. All right, now let's enter Bob. Okay, so bob@smith.com. Welcome, Bob Smith. You are now in the app. So there was an yes.
For regex, is that a similar approach you use for credit card sequence validation?
Mm-hmm.
What else are major implementations of regex on the website?
That's a good question. Credit cards, email addresses. Yeah, I was gonna say that might be a good one as well. Yeah, exactly. Right. Right.
So what happened when you did session there?
Hmm?
What did you do with session there?
So what I did was I added the user ID that just came back. So when we ran this insert query into our database, it returns the ID of the last inserted record. So that ID would be the one that we just inserted. I set that in my session at user ID. That way when we get to the other page, we'll be able to query our database to find that specific user so that when he's seeing the page, we can actually welcome him by name. All right. I think there was another question about how to get these things so that they showed up underneath the individual inputs. And the approach that you can take, so we can use these things called categories with Flash messages. So what that would look like in our code is that, Trying to come up with an example here. So here's how it would look like in the template itself. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So normally we're just doing get flash messages with no arguments inside. We're just invoking it by itself. So that's giving us all the flash messages. If we want to actually do a category filter like this, so let's say we only wanted email errors to show up in this specific block, we could do a category filter for email, and then when we actually set that error, we could call it out by name. So see if there's an example here. You would enter that as the second argument to your flash. So the first argument, of course, would be the error like we've been doing, and then the second argument would be the actual category that you want that to be associated with. So if I wanted this error to be just for emails, for instance, I could do comma and then in quotes email, and then in my template I would just filter out for that. Okay. And I'll post up this. I think it's actually linked in there. Let me see if that's it. Yeah. So they talk about flash messages with categories in here. So that's exactly how we would do it. This is the error, and then this is the category of the error, and then your template you could actually filter for that specific kind of error. All right. The other way that you could do it is that you could turn your flash errors into some kind of a dictionary. So your dictionary could have different keys in it. It could have an email key. It could have a first name key and so forth. And then in your template, you could look out for those keys. So you could say something like, if email in we would say something like with errors equals get flash messages, something like that. Okay?
Does that mean?
Yes.
Does that mean flash can be any type? Like the argument of flash doesn't need to be string.
I can't imagine that you'd want it to be anything else, but we should be able to make that into an integer.
Can I just pass in
We
that
could make that
object?
an integer or something like that if that's what you want.
But like, can I just pass in an object as my first argument?
Yeah.
And then contains all those.
Yeah. So if you pass in a dictionary, then that way we can sort of parse through it and see, do we have an error for email or something like that. So keep in mind that when you access Flash on the front end in your Jinja template, it's going to come as a list. So if you're going to do it as a dictionary, you probably need to reference the first item in the list. You'd also need to make sure that there is something in the list, because if you try to access the first element of the list and the list is empty, then there's that problem, right? So this is kind of the simpler approach. If we just want to simply iterate through all the errors, we do it like this. We set the errors equal to get flash messages, and then we just iterate through them with a simple for loop. Okay? And I don't want you guys to get too hung up on making sure each individual error shows up under the individual form input, because yes, from a user standpoint, that is a pretty important thing. But in terms of you guys progressing and moving along, don't take a ton of time trying to do it. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions about what we did here? No? Yes.
For rejects.
Regex.
I'm assuming like you can use that for password validation too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when some websites ask you to at least have an uppercase or a number.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you
That's
say
a good point.
that's easier to use regex or just create a function to check?
Oh, I definitely think you'd want to use regex on that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think doing the function approach, like basically we don't want to rewrite things that are already available for us. So if regex allows us to check that pattern efficiently, let's use that. Yeah. That's a good point. Yes?
What's the typical approach to block someone from entering a script in your form field?
Usually you have to rely on your templating will kind of do some of that. So let's just check. I think Jinja has that by default. Jinja 2 cross-site scripting. Yeah, so there's some information about this cross-site scripting. So yeah, it's automatically escaping values for us. And then there are some caveats in here too. There are other places where you have to be careful. Generating HTML without the help of Jinja 2. So in other words, if we were just passing our template, because I believe there's a way to actually display something that doesn't get escaped, and we don't really want to do that. Cross-site. Yeah, for the purposes of the assignments here, you're not going to have to worry about somebody hacking, but that's a really good question, and I will link this on Mattermost so that you guys can peek and just kind of see like how does Flask help protect us from this type of attack. Yeah.
What about attempts? Password attempts.
Well, you could easily set something in session to say, you know, how many times has this person attempted to log in.
So you can create a session to track how many times they've attempted to log in?
Sure. Why not? Yeah, we're already using the session, so there's nothing wrong with that.
Could they clear the session from the browser?
Yeah, or you could start saving it in the database if you really want to get like super locked down. Right? I mean, ultimately, the most protected thing is going to be your server in the back end. So if we can kind of keep track of what a user's doing, then we can keep tabs on it a little bit better with the server. On the front end, it's sort of like the Wild West. You know, they could try to pull a lot of stuff on the front end. Yes.
So I see Robert's server.py yesterday, and then he did something that's super cool. So he declared a variable like right after app equal to Flask.
Okay.
And that's sort of like a global variable. So
Sure.
can we use that?
Why was he doing that though?
I was trying to use the variable in two different functions.
Yeah, so that
At
all
first,
functions will
I
have
had
access to those.
Oh yeah. I mean that's okay, but what was in the variable is what I'm
I
asking.
think it was the random numbers.
Oh.
And I was trying to generate it in one function.
Okay.
And
So here's the issue with that. If you create a global variable like that, the random number is the same for every user now. Is that the way that you wanted it to be?
No, I mean I ended up changing it afterwards.
Yeah, so that's what's going to happen is that every user is now getting the same random number, and that also probably means that as soon as somebody wins the game and you reset the number, you've now reset it for everyone else. So if they were guessing and they guessed too high or something like that, well, now their old guess may have, you know, maybe they're going to be misinformed because you just changed the random number on them when they didn't do anything because it was a different user who won the game.
The reason I'm asking this.
So that's a moving target.
I wonder if there's any way to store the session like not locally. Because what if so a lot of the website would ask you if we can use cookies on you, and then I would say no, don't use cookies.
Okay.
But does that mean I won't have my session?
Yeah, that's probably an issue. It's essentially you need to allow cookies in order to be able to, you know, maintain some kind of consistent state between requests. Sometimes there you might see if you go on websites, like sometimes an old PHP website, there might be a query parameter up there. It might say something like session ID equals some long kind of hashed out ID or whatever. So it could happen that way if the person didn't accept cookies. But, you know, if you're using the web these days, chances are you're going to have to accept the fact that people are watching you. If you don't want to be watched, hop off the web. Yeah, it's just the reality. Anything else? You guys feel pretty good? How about thumbs on this? Yeah? Yeah. So.
It's one of those things where I feel like, you kind of have to experiment with it to really get it.
Yeah.
Like it's good to see it just so we have a frame of
Sure.
reference, but then you really gotta kind of do
Course.
it and mess it up a couple times to get it.
That's pretty much true of all of this stuff, As you practice it, it starts to make more sense.
Yeah.
Cool. I will dismiss you guys and let you continue on with your work.